Hello, everyone. Eli Lake, Washington Times New Republic. Heather Hurlburt, National Security Network, Democratic speechwriter, and you just came back from the White House.
Just back from the sort of calling the think tank community together meeting on Egypt, talking about where we are, where we're going. I don't want to, in a funny way, I think that misleads the viewers into thinking that I know some super secret thing, which I just want to assure you I don't. But Eli, I think the really fascinating thing that I did draw out of it is that there's really not anyone in Washington, inside or outside government, who thinks that Mubarak is going to survive this at this point.
Okay.
And I think that's a bipartisan assessment. The other bipartisan assessment that really quite surprised me, actually, and I think this will get right into arguing with you, is the degree of shared understanding, including among prominent people who are not Democrats, that the Muslim Brotherhood is going to have to be part of the equation here, and part of that is we, the U.S., have to figure out a way that our diplomats and officials are allowed to talk to and interact with them.
Why would that be a source of argument with me? I've been pretty. You can go back to the blogging heads in this, but I've been pretty sober-minded about the Muslim Brotherhood. I would generally agree with that. We can get into the details in a second. But let me first ask you this: do you get the impression that the president and the National Security Council and the Obama administration know what they're doing on this?
To the extent that anybody knows what they're doing, Eli, you could argue that it took the protesters the better part of a week before they actually did sort of get together and name a negotiating committee yesterday. So this is one of these sort of fabulous moments where events are running much faster than anyone's efforts to control or shape them. So, in the sense of, does the administration have a plan that encompasses all eventualities, and that everything that happens next, they say, yes, we've already anticipated that? No, they don't, because, frankly, nobody, including the people who are making this unfold, nobody knew how it was going to unfold. Now, having said that, I think they're doing, and, given how incredibly fast this is going, I think they're doing a decent job of managing it, but no, of course they don't know exactly what they're doing, because nobody does.
I thought the response was chaotic and haphazard from Thursday through Friday. And what I mean is, I thought that the message from the Blair interview with Biden was, we're staying with Mubarak, and then Hillary came out with very strong statements about reviewing the aid and saying, you don't use violence to suppress the demonstrations. And then the painful conference with Robert Gibbs on Friday, where he couldn't tell us whether or not President Obama tried to even contact Hosni Mubarak. Then there was, of course, the Mubarak speech. Then Obama and Mubarak spoke. And then I felt like Obama's statement was very it was problematic from the perspective of, there are no really good options here, but you kind of have to choose one. You're either going to have credibility with what comes after Mubarak and the Egyptian people and the Egyptian demonstrators, and that would mean, I think, a stronger statement saying, that Mubarak has to go, which he didn't say. Or you have to stick by your client because you know that General Kiani and King Abdullah and other American clients needed for the war on terror are watching how you play a crisis in Cairo with one of America's most closest clients in the world. And the perception that there was distance, or that Obama was distancing and didn't want to be seen with Mubarak, I think, on that Friday could have damaged that. And I'm not saying that, I'm not advocating one choice or the other, but I kind of felt like the White House didn't want to make a choice.
Well, I actually think, Eli, there's another way.
Yeah.
I agree with you about the earlier part of the week, that they say they had 3 consistent points, but I think they didn't always come out in the most consistent way. But if you think about sort of where we were on Friday afternoon, Mubarak hadn't spoken, not clear what he was going to do, various rumors shooting around, presumably all kinds of back-channel contacts in different directions. And as you say, that you're not just talking to Mubarak and the Egyptian people, you're also talking to the Saudi rulers and the Saudi people, the Jordanian, et cetera, et cetera. So in a way, what you want to put forward there is not so much, we've made a choice based on the limited information that we have, but for any ruler who gets in this situation, here are the things that you would have to do for us to continue to support you. And hence the language about no violence, and the language about respecting universal rights, and the language about transition. So before Mubarak spoke, which is when Gibbs went out on Friday afternoon, I actually thought that was a perfectly reasonable, and actually sort of ratcheting up mentioning the aid was certainly ratcheting up the pressure further than had been done before. So I actually think that was a pretty deftly handled day, given that Mubarak chose not to go out until basically midnight in Egypt, and that you had to try to get away from this all being personalized about Mubarak and try to get it into, well, what are the things that would be enough to see for the U.S. to keep standing by an ally versus what are the things that wouldn't. And now I think you have the challenge. The commentary that I saw that I found the most impressive is what the administration could be doing more of is not saying Mubarak has to do this, Mubarak has to do that, but saying the final outcome has to include open government, freely contested elections, release of political prisoners, an end to the state of emergency, maybe some engagement with constitutional reform, which the protesters are calling for, but that you make it clear what your end state is. And you say, well, from the U.S. point of view, it doesn't really matter who the leader is, as long as he, in this case, is abiding by those norms and is moving Egypt toward those norms. And so I actually think it would be more constructive to drive further in that direction rather than get caught up in this Mubarak, no Mubarak.
Well, easy to say, harder to do. We're Mubarak's patron, whether we like it or not. I mean, America's Mubarak's patron, whether we like it or not. There was something that Hillary said on the talk shows yesterday, which I found strained particularly credulity, when she said, for 30 years we've been urging the Egyptian government, in private and public and at times, to make democratic reforms. And that's just, I mean, it's misleading. Yes, there have been talking points with diplomats and ambassadors with the Egyptians, but we've largely turned a blind eye. There was a moment in 2005, for most of that year, where U.S.-Egypt policy was really in play, and American pressure forced Mubarak to have an actually competitive legislative election in November, as you remember. I was in Cairo at the time. I remember covering it. It was actually a very hopeful moment, until, of course, the regime completely crushed it and then proceeded to arrest Ayman Noor, who was the one person who kind of was running against Mubarak in the presidential elections that year, and the entire freedom agenda for Egypt was shut down. And, the Bush administration, and particularly the ambassador in Cairo, said nothing. And I think that was the one time when the policy really was in play, that there was a chance to try to use American leverage to really try to forward democratic reforms in Egypt.
Well, Eli, in point of fact, there's actually, I would say, about once a decade been different kinds of moments where people thought that openness was in play and that there was actually going to be some kind of change. There was the moment in the early 90s when Egypt was really booming economically and people thought there would be some greater opening up, and then there was some change that people actually looked to with some gratitude in the first 10 years of Mubarak's reign. So agreed that 2005 was one of those moments. It wasn't.
I don't think 93 was a serious moment when the U.S. policy was going to change in such a way that
I'm
was
not
pressure.
actually talking about U.S. policy.
Okay.
I'm actually talking about changes in Egyptian policy.
Well, okay, but my point was about U.S. policy.
For 30 years,
my point
there's been on and off,
okay,
sort of, hot and cold. Mm-hmm. We really want you to take democratic change, but we're not prepared to put anything serious at risk to make that happen. Yeah.
Except there was one moment, there was a moment in 2005 when maybe the U.S. was going to use all of its leverage with Mubarak to open up the system, and then ended up not doing it.
Yeah, so, I mean, in retrospect, the sort of maybe, close only counts in, what is this? What is the saying I'm groping for? Close only counts in horseshoes.
Something like that. But the point being that I think there was potentially this moment to have, a kind of freedom forward policy for Egypt. Ultimately, that was seen as something that ultimately the U.S. went in another direction and said we need Mubarak for the peace process. We need Mubarak as an ally in the war on terrorism. We need Mubarak as a beacon of stability diplomatically and other ways in the region, and the price for that is that we're just not going to press him on these things, and that's what happened, unfortunately. And now we have a crisis. So what looked like stability for the last 30 years was a pressure cooker. And now I think Obama and the United States doesn't have very good options and is going to probably be less effective because it didn't push for the kind of reforms at other moments. Whether that it didn't seize.
Yeah, Eli, there's no arguing about that. We totally agree about that. I do think though, sort of one thing that people need to recognize is that it's a little just saying, oh, Mubarak should go. So what are we really talking about here? As somewhat similar to what we saw in Tunisia, the army is in control. And Mubarak will go when the army decides it's time for him to go. And he will be replaced either by Suleiman, who is also, a product of the military, a creature of that world,
right,
has been Mubarak's henchman for 30 years. And so the real question at this point, and, that the sort of, oh, Mubarak has to go doesn't begin to answer, is do you have a transition that's just, we put someone else in who's a moderately less reviled face in Egypt, although Suleiman doesn't fit that description because everyone in Egypt knows perfectly well that he's been Mubarak's henchman. Or are we actually signaling that this has to be a transition that moves forward to some kind of more open democratic structure? And that is, in terms of sort of what us pundits spend our oxygen about, that is a much more important, are we figuring out and doing the right things to move toward that outcome, which may not include pushing Mubarak to go before whatever comes next is ready, or are we just expending our breath saying, oh, Mubarak has to go?
Well, but another point here is that if the United States had invested in the political and civic opposition to Mubarak, which is not just the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, there's a lot of other points in between, that we would have had more credibility with the people who are organizing the demonstrators on the streets, and to broker that kind of transition from dictatorship to democracy in many ways, as the United States has successfully done in places like the Philippines or in places like Georgia. But because America stuck with Mubarak to the bitter end like this, and really didn't use its leverage to try to get him to govern in a more humane and open way, I don't know how much credibility the United States will have in fashioning that solution that I think everybody would agree we would like to see a transition to more openness in a sort of stable way. Would you agree with that?
We have two really crucial levers which everyone in Egypt understands that we have, and of course the question is both how we use them and how we are seen to use them. And one is with Mubarak personally, and the other is with the military. And I think you've seen, I see this creation of a negotiating committee that includes El Baradei, also a representative from the Brotherhood, also somebody from the WAFT, also people from Tahrir Square, as a really optimistic sign that, in fact, Egyptian civil society doesn't need us to sort it out.
No, I agree. No, that's not what I was saying.
The question is, yes, it would be much better if Egypt had more vibrant political institutions and if we had been on the side of developing those vibrant political institutions a little more clearly. However, what we have right now is the ability to make it clear, not just to Mubarak, but to the guys who are still going to be around once Mubarak finds his new home in Saudi Arabia or goes to Germany for medical treatment or whatever it is, making it clear to those guys that there are actually going to have to be significant changes in how Egypt is ruled that it'll allow for real, genuine popular participation. And that's a lever that we absolutely have. God knows we paid for it 1,000 times over, and we're going to need, as I said, to find a way to use it.
I agree that we have the lever with the army and the regime, but I'm saying that there's a question mark as to whether American brokered deal will be credible to the opposition.
No, it can't be an American brokered deal, actually. I don't think it can't be an American brokered deal, but it has to be saying to the army, if you want our support going forward, you've got to go broker a deal that's acceptable.
Okay.
Yeah, I know it's much better, in my view, if it's not an American brokered deal.
Okay.
That if it's clear that the people of Egypt stood up and did this themselves.
No, obviously.
Well,
listen, first of all, the people of Egypt are doing it themselves. The crisis that has been created by these demonstrations is evidence of that. So they take the credit. I wasn't saying that the U.S. is taking the credit for it. I'm saying that there is, I don't worry about the credibility with the institutions like you just said. I worried about whether or not the U.S. will be seen by what comes next, and as in this critical transition, as somebody who, as a force that really does have the best interest of a sort of opening of the Egyptian society, of making Egypt more democratic in mind. Because I think when...
And that's why I'd like to see statements about final outcomes, I think, Eli, because that is sort of the thing that you can do publicly to influence folks.
But there's an inescapable...
where it is that the U.S. wants to see Egypt go.
There's an inescapable irony when Hillary Clinton tells...
Only one?
Right, but when Hillary Clinton tells Christiane Amanpour that for 30 years the U.S. has been pushing for democratic reform in Egypt, while American-made F-16s are buzzing the demonstrators in Tahrir Square, and we all worry that the American-made tanks hopefully will not fire on those demonstrators. There is something that it's like an emperor has no clothes moment. I mean, I understand why Hillary Clinton...
Yeah, welcome to American foreign policy in the 21st century.
Yes.
Someone actually from outside the administration made a point which is really very sobering to think about, which is if you have a full democratic transition in Egypt, what's going to come out of the archives? And when you release all the political prisoners who've been tortured, all the things that are going to come out about our complicity and
rendition. We're going to...
And rendition too. Yeah. So this is as much as this is going to be the freedom that Egyptians we hope are going to gain out of this. It's going to produce a lot of ugly and sad truths for the U.S. about, and bipartisan truths about things we've done in our...
I think that's right. Okay, now let's move. We have a dozen minutes left, and there's three things I'd like to cover quickly, okay? And so let me start with a kind of banal point, but I think one that's worth making, okay? Right now, the real Likud party, Heather, in Israel, and for that matter, the Israeli national establishment, they would like to keep Mubarak or Suleiman, and they are not for Egyptian democracy. That's the Israeli position.
If we're for stability through change, they're for stability then change.
Exactly. The position of neoconservatives in American or Washington foreign policy, like Elliot Abrams, is let's transition to democracy. They are for freedom. And I bring this up because I think there is a laziness among a certain kind of pundit that equates Likudnik with neoconservative in Washington. And I think that this moment, this hinge in history that we're at right now, puts the lie to this petty bigotry, which is to say that...
So Eli, let's actually back off the political name calling, because
I'm responding to what I think has been 7 years of
what I want to know is what's going to happen, because the split I'm delighted you brought up Elliot Abrams, so I didn't need to.
Right.
And it's also, the Israelis' point of view is understandable, because in the short term, this is going to make things very bumpy for them, although people who know Egypt well argue that in the long term, there's actually, it's not at all inevitable that a popularly elected Egyptian government would reject the peace process.
I don't think they will.
But so what happens between the Likudniks and their U.S. neoconservative supporters over this?
That's the whole point, though. It's like this is the thing, is that there has been a false and libelous literature, largely written by the left and the Buchanan right, that has. I'm not saying you do this, but has sort of painted neoconservatives as agents of a foreign political party, when any amount of research or any kind of knowledge about the situation would understand that actually the neoconservatives believe that Arab and Middle Eastern democracy generally was a good thing, and that the U.S. should be a supporter of that. And the Israelis, for the most part, never believed that.
Eli, can I just have a question for you, which is that the Israeli government, which is full of the sorts of people you're referencing, is going to be dismayed to see its allies in the U.S. Pushing more vigorously for change and apple cart upsetting Egyptian democracy. What's the response in Israel to that?
The Israelis have a U.S.-American-based lobby called AIPAC, of American citizens, that will probably do a very good job of supporting the Israeli point of view on this. Okay, I have no doubt. I don't know this personally, but I'm saying I have no doubt that the Israeli position of stability then changes I think really accurately, but will be represented by AIPAC. But AIPAC is not synonymous with neoconservatives who, on this very important issue, agree with the only Israeli politician who agrees with the neoconservatives is Natan Sharansky, who is completely out of the center of Israeli power. The Israelis are cynical about Arab democracy. They're cynical that the Egyptian street would yield anything other than tension, if not the abrogation of the peace treaty and all kinds of other things that they don't see as in their interest. And they see as very problematic. Neoconservatives, on the other hand, believe that dictatorships, whether they are aligned with the United States or against the United States, are ticking time bombs in this regard and actually contribute to Jewish eliminationism and anti-Israel sentiment, because it's the one opinion that you could have in Mubarak's Egypt that you were allowed to express. You couldn't say, I think that, Hosni Mubarak is a fool and an autocrat and he should go, until, of course, now. But you could say that I hate Israel, well, there's a famous song in Egypt when I was there called I Hate Israel and I Love Amr Moussa, who was the former Secretary General of the Arab League. But that was something that was the one thing that you were allowed to say. So this was, I just want to point out, this was always a split, but it's really coming to the fore right now that neoconservatives, who certainly, yes, they support Israel, as many other political factions in Washington do. But on this important point...
There's been some sadness expressed, actually, including from some political folks at the White House this morning, that one of the things that the Egypt situation was going to do was postpone progress on Middle East peace, to which my response was kind of, there was going to be some progress that you were holding out on us. So I kind of didn't really view that as very serious.
Yeah, that's delusional.
That there are very serious people. There are very serious people who think that something was brewing behind the scenes.
What do we get from Omar Suleiman's training of the preventive security services in 2008? In 2007, when Hamas was taking over Gaza, where was Jibril Rajoub? Where was Mohammed Dahlan? Where were these people that were trained by the Egyptians and supported by the Egyptians and created in the 1990s during the Oslo years as the counter and responsible sort of state-building mechanism against Hamas? When it really finally came down to it, they didn't even really bother to fight. So at the end of the day, I think that part of the ledger from Mubarak and the price of Mubarak's repression, it wasn't as good a deal as people had promised.
Well, this is one where the neocon human rights agenda and the liberal internationalist human rights agenda come together. Eli, I'm not going to argue with you on that, but I do want to keep pushing you to spin out a little more. What Jerusalem does next.
I don't know what the options are from the Israeli perspective. I mean, I think that they kind of have to wait and see what comes next. I doubt very much, even if there was a significant Muslim Brotherhood faction, I mean, there will be a Muslim Brotherhood faction in what comes next. So let's just put that out there. And we should. I want to make this point because
let's transition into that as our final point. Right. But assuming that what comes next, I mean, the best case scenario is that what comes next has sort of a strong military underpinning, a strong civilian front with a broad coalition aspect that includes some strand, probably one of the more moderate ones, of the Brotherhood.
Well, here's what I would say. It's the Muslim Brotherhood is not. By the way,
that's by far the best thing that could happen.
Say that again.
I said, inshallah, that we come out of this that way.
Well, I would point out, and it's something that I think is lost, particularly in some of the commentary on the right, that there was a major split after 1966 when Nasser executed Sayyid Qutb, who was a more radical Muslim Brotherhood leader. That there were followers of Qutb who eventually formed Egyptian Islamic Jihad and murdered Anwar Sadat. And then there was a more mainstream Muslim Brotherhood faction that Sadat allowed to organize in the universities and became a big part of regular Egyptian civil society. When I was living in Egypt, I interviewed members of the Muslim Brotherhood who were the head of the equivalent of the American Medical Association for Egypt, or the major newspaper editors. So the Muslim Brotherhood...
Or at the very least, one of the American Baptist Associations.
Right. Sort of, I mean, I would say, listen, but that said, Muslim Brotherhood is not benign. They support Hamas. They support, I think, ultimately, the decline or the shrinking of any rights for women in Egypt. There are a lot of things that are problematic about the Muslim Brotherhood. And, of course, the really pregnant question is, will they abide by the rules of competitive politics and civil society if they get power? Certainly, Ayatollah Khomeini had a lot of people fooled in 1979 that he was interested in a democracy for Iran, when we now know that he wasn't. So the really important thing, it would be nice to lock in the Muslim Brotherhood now to a deal where they agreed to not do what Hezbollah does, which is to resort to militias and violence when they don't get what they want, and they agree to a kind of competitive political process that allows for other political parties to share power and to have regular elections and so forth. And
so Eli, three quick things on that. First is that, totally agreed, but it's very hard to even try to lock the Brotherhood into anything when there are congressional restrictions that prevent official Americans from talking to them. So that's one thing that's just going to have to change. Point two, to add to what you said, people should know that there was further, and going as far back as the 80s, really strong hostility and open fighting between Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yes, absolutely.
And so there's this kind of lazy tendency in some U.S. domestic political commentary to say, oh, it's all the same thing, but it's really not. And a great resource, which we'll put up, is a chapter in a West Point counterterrorism study that came out about 3 months ago called Our Own Worst Enemies, I believe. And there's a whole chapter sort of documenting back to the 80s and looking at actually Zawahiri, who came out of Egypt, out of the Brotherhood.
Right. He's criticized them plenty of times.
Yeah. So that is something that Americans should understand from the American security perspective. But then I think the last thing that's going to be difficult and that we are going to have to prepare to live with is it's clear that there's factionalism within the Brotherhood on exactly those issues, and that it's not going to be, it's never going to be possible and clean to sort of get to a day where everybody in the Brotherhood says we love apple pie and miniskirts, because it's going to be a very messy, unnerving scenario. And then I think something else that has happened is that people have been let out of Egyptian prisons.
Yeah, well, there's a breakout.
Not just the Brotherhood, but a lot. Let breakout, but it's a little unclear. There's some questions about what the security ministries were thinking to let that happen. So you've got a mix of Brotherhood folks and hardened criminals, and the potential that security could deteriorate in really ways that threaten a transition. Yes, exactly like what happened
right before the invasion with Saddam. I think you're right. I think that you also, though, have to be wary because the Muslim Brotherhood chapter in Gaza is Hamas. And my view, and it's not just my view, I think it's a lot of people's view, that kind of maximalism is not good for the Palestinians or the prospect of a two-state solution. And if you have an Egyptian government that is openly supporting, instead of having kind of efforts underground to support Hamas, then that really is going to be a major irritant. And what I think is a likely scenario is that you would have open support for Hamas that is officially at war with Israel, but not the abrogation of the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. And so the cold peace will become colder and less stable. And that would, I think, be a real problem. And finally, the question that we don't know is, are there Muslim Brotherhood cells in the military? Anyone who's spent time in Egypt, as I have, will be told by the military, no, that we don't allow that, could never happen. And whenever I hear something, some people tell me that with such, they're so sure of themselves, I'm always skeptical as a reporter. So I've always had in the back of my mind, where are the Muslim Brotherhood? And I just would say, Saif al-Adil, a major al-Qaeda figure, was a product of the Egyptian military, as other al-Qaeda figures have been. So it's not unheard of.
So just, Eli, the last thing I would want to say is that the logic which says, number one, you have to let go of Mubarak and allow genuine popular democracy to emerge in Egypt, and you have to prepare yourself to deal with the Brotherhood being part of that. That logic also suggests that the U.S. position on not engaging with Hamas has to change as long as the Palestinians haven't been able to put up a genuinely popular governing alternative to Hamas, especially in Gaza. And so not to, I think the best case, one best case outcome out of all of this is perhaps Egypt again becomes central in actually providing a channel through which Hamas can be engaged, which would, is ultimately going to be necessary to whatever kind of stable agreement.
No, I think. Well, if I could just on that one point, the difference between Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood is that the Muslim Brotherhood, as best as I know, does not have an armed militia and does not have a suicide bomber wing. Hamas does,
Oh,
and that's
agreed
the
completely.
key difference. If you have a suicide
Yep,
bomber
the
wing,
Brotherhood's
you
much
don't get
easier.
the goodies of engaging with the West. Sorry, that's got to be the deal, and I think that's what the key essence of the Obama Cairo speech was, which was, listen, we're willing to, let you guys into the political system, Islamist groups, but you have to play by the political rules. You can't appeal to violence later on. I think that's the takeaway of what Obama was saying. I think that would still tell you that Hamas, and plus they're just an odious anti-Israel organization. So, I mean,
Yeah. Unfortunately, odious doesn't disqualify you in world politics.
Right.
Eli, I apologize. I've got to
too.
jump, but I think we should promise the viewers that we come back to this in 10 days or so.
Yeah,
and sort of
I'll be
hold
happy
ourselves
to.
accountable for how many things we
We
each
will,
said
and
that
then
turned out
let's
to be.
try to post. I have a
totally
bunch
wrong.
of stuff that's going to be coming online in the next hours or so, so we should try to do that. Okay.
Great,
All right,
great. Well, good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. Okay, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.